Hey guys and girls, this is Matt Yang, and welcome to my podcast. Today we're going to be taking a look at the ever-present but most intriguing debate on popular versus classical music, and, in my personal opinion, why the rift between the two, not so vast after all. Let's jump right in. Throughout the ages and time periods since the 1300s-ish, there's been a prominent existence of various ideologies, categorizations, and assumptions pertaining to the vast, constantly changing universe of music and musical culture. Among these thoughts and opinions exists a rift that seems to date back to the beginning of formally recorded notational music history. The idea that music could be present in different cultures and settings, like the Scholian drinking songs in the lavish homes of ancient Greece, or the much more recent symphonic works in the concert halls of Vienna, was quite a mind-blowing realization to fathom. However, out of the differing musical environments and works composed for varying purposes, there emerged an unspoken, subtle divide that split existing musical communities into stylistic factions of sorts. The two most prominent styles that have stuck around and gradually developed over a long period of time, in addition to being recognized as the forefronts of the present-day music scene, are that of classical and popular music. In this podcast, I would like to discuss the various ways in which we value classical music differently than pop music, as well as what merits this separation, and why the two stylistic realms are more similar than one might think of in the modern music world. A good portion of today's society seems to value classical works as these elite, hollowed timepieces with a cemented place in the musical canon, therefore more substantial than pop. Contrastingly, the same idea is linked to the viewpoint of popular pieces as these temporary, potentially amateuristic tunes for the general population, meant to be cyclically consumed and, for lack of a better term, forgotten about, save for a select few iconic generational hits. This warrants the claim that popular music would, therefore, be less substantial than classical. However, there are several crucial aspects of both styles that actually have striking similarities, and in a certain light can be seen more similar to each other than they are different. But first, some historical context. Fun. Classical music, get this, exists as a label for specific music that has been composed, notated/written down, and performed for an audience, one could say since the medieval ages. A key part to its existence is the idea of tradition and the way composers acknowledged and or adhered to that tradition, whether it be utilizing tonal systems, musical forms, or other aspects that would collectively be determined to fit underneath a more broader classical umbrella. Music itself, however, existed way before this label came out, through documented fragments of history passed down through ancient oral traditions, and so on and so on. Classical music itself did not really have that label attached to it until later on with the establishment of musicology and other historical musical studies and practices, this is a tongue twister, that began to organize, compile, and categorize different eras, and to a greater extent, different styles. Popular music, on the other hand, is a little more slightly ambiguous in relation to its development throughout history. For example, popular music existing as a label could be defined as music of the current period that was well recognized and accessible to its listeners. This would mean that some classical composers and works could be considered popular composers of their time. For the purpose of this podcast, however, we will establish the popular music label through a more modernized lens. What I mean by that is that some say the development of popular music is aligned in a historical timeline with the recent industrial and technological revolutions of the late 18th through the mid-20th century, rather than a large time frame where music became accessible on a global scale. This was also a point where the world was becoming increasingly more connected and allowing cultural influences across all geographical and political boundaries to be discovered, shared, and borrowed from, especially in terms of the musical tradition. Now, breaking down this idea of classical and popular music, and to a greater extent defining it, here's the million-dollar question. What defines classical and popular music? Here, classical music will refer to art music that has been written in the Western European notational tradition, following pre-established rules and systems of tonality, or lack thereof, arranging for accepted instrumentations and utilizing core elements of music. Classical music achieves that in a way that warrants a certain reverence and respect for the composition and composer to the point of potentially being assimilated into the historical canon. For popular, there are still difficulties that exist in trying to pin a single, all-encompassing explanation for it, both to the dilemmas I mentioned earlier, as well as due to its often referral in a light that more so takes the musically uneducated listener into account. Here, popular music will refer to music that is considered to be of lower value and complexity than art music, and to be readily accessible to large numbers of musically uneducated listeners rather to an elite. My first point, musical elements and aesthetics. This argument I will make on the grounds of shared musical aesthetics and elements between the classical and popular styles. An important preface that I want to make is the concept that fluidity in musical boundaries is constantly present, whether listening to one type of music or another, and the constant transformation, adaptation, and impermanence of musical practices means that each work in similar and different styles can be distinguishable yet still have shared traits. Music historian Charles Ham frames it in this manner. Just as art music may refer to Gregorian chant, grand opera, string quartets, and minimalist percussion music, popular music is an umbrella term that encompasses a wide set of variously distinct, though often related, genres. Taking a look at a specific aspect of this dichotomy, the aesthetic technique of borrowing as a compositional element can be used quite similarly between the two styles. On a broad scale, all music draws on a collective resource of notes, scales, and gestures, which in a way lends itself to an unavoidable amount of borrowing from earlier pieces in its own tradition. In the Baroque era, composers such as Monteverdi and Frescobaldi wrote cantus firmus settings and sets of variations, taking either the dance forms of secular music or the content, and sometimes both, and applying it to their own works in the church classical setting. Comparatively, 17th, 18th century European popular tunes were often reused for newly composed texts in genres like the vaudeville, broadside ballad, and ballad opera. The term for this reusage, coined the contrafactum or contrafact, was a prime example of a popular music-centric technique. Other examples include the Star Spangled Banner, which was set to the tune of an English drinking song, or jazz pieces that incorporate new melodies into familiar pre-established chord progressions. In each instance, you can see how the overarching ideas of borrowing is used in particular styles. But the important thing to notice is how the incorporation of musical materials into these works came from opposing styles and traditions. The composers here see the credibility value, or at the very least, appeal of what a music from a different style could mean for their own art and traditions. Switching gears to a more element-oriented take, both classical and popular music can be found in the roots of American song, specifically African-American influence on both church and jazz music. In the case of classical church music, there's a basis to be found of said influence in Black gospel music of the early 20th century. At this time, the shape note hymnody that existed as the centerpiece of Protestant worship was taken by Black churches in the rural American South and transformed into gospel hymnody, combining the predominantly white religious tradition with the older African-American melodies of spiritual and slave song origin. Regarding popular music, there are certain elements of those very same spirituals and slave songs that manifested themselves through the likes of jazz and Dixieland styles. Contrastingly to the melodies of being copied for religious music, the driving rhythms and improvisational aspects of the older traditions were utilized, creating music branching off in a completely different setting and style than that of its religious counterpart. Regardless of specific differences in the application of African-American musical elements, there's no denying that the tradition that fostered both church classical and jazz pop music allowed a strand of connections to be formed between the two by sheer nature of the traditional similarities in which they gleaned from. Big idea number 2, why classical and popular music are more similar than you think, is due to the relative nature of the audience and accessibility of the music. Now, I know what you might be thinking. How are audience and accessibility even a similarity between the two styles in this day and age? And I will answer that question right now. Instead of making the case for how they are similar, I'd like to delve into instead how the perception of the audience members and the accessibility of each style to their listeners produces similar effects for both classical and popular music. In discussing accessibility, for example, there's a time when mainstream press was starting to take off, eventually reaching the majority of American listeners outside of the concert hall. In this period, which could date back to the World War I era, classical music stations aired professional performances and covered conversations by critics in the columns of printed news. The pattern also appears in American musical culture through the flourishing of the Tin Pan Alley era. During this time, songwriters were able to collaborate their works, and sheet music was mass-produced for use in the home. The similarities here are found in the accessibility of music, granted in slightly different aspects, but still to the same means and purpose of promoting art, regardless of style, and generating a larger audience and interest towards the indicated genres. Upon taking a closer look at the element of the audience, we can see that in both classical and popular music, there exists a spectrum of educated and uneducated listeners that can interpret performed music for themselves and reach similar conclusions and feelings of satisfaction upon hearing a well-written work. In classical music, this is expressed through American composer William Henry Fry's works, specifically through the through-composed opera entitled Lenora. What was special about this was Fry's innovation in building upon the well-known Bellini opera model by blending it with a uniquely American style and distinguishable compositional choices, like purposely writing the libretti in English. For Fry's audience, those who are aware of the classical tradition and familiar with Bellini and his monumental operas know what to expect. However, the expectations are rattled and thrown out more so for the educated listener than for the casual through the educated listener engaging in an inner dialogue with themselves. They'd be able to appreciate the music and artistry they're experiencing while trying to question and discover where the work and the composer, in this case Fry, is going due to preconceived notions of how a work, in this case the opera, would sound. In the same way, listeners can be encouraged to engage with popular music as well, appreciating its many aspects while digging deeper to discover what makes a song so universally effective. There's something to be said about innovation in popular music, and regardless of the content, there exists a legitimate demographic of educated popular music listeners who also find similar satisfaction in both experiencing and picking apart subtle details of particularly iconic and substantial works. Whether enjoying a tune due to the catchy melody line or repetitive rhythmic ostinato, the content and style of the piece matters a lot less when, frankly, there are individuals who can appreciate the tiniest details within them, which is the point I'm making in saying that the audience's perception, regardless of listening strictly to classical or popular music, practically yields the same feelings and results. But wait, I have so many unanswered questions, and I'd be happy to answer them for you, Matt. Listen here. There are those that may disagree with the sentiments I've expressed. Some might say that due to the nature of this fluidity between classical and popular roots, influence, and traditions, the concept of popular music itself is perpetually changing and thus has no permanent musical characteristics or consistent connections to its audience. This train of thought would theoretically and ultimately render popular music as dissimilar to classical music in this respect. And one could recognize the logic behind such an assumption. However, this is false, because popular music, just like classical music, does indeed have characteristics that are found in various works of popular artists throughout the recent century. To address this, I will give an example of popular music in the educational system. For instance, in high school and collegiate music history courses, there normally are sections dedicated to popular and jazz styles, as the historical period discussed inches closer towards the present. Here, instructors would take the time to utilize a listening example that is well familiar to students of the same generation as the pop hit in question. Upon mention of formal analysis of the piece, the discussion could shift to various elements of music that the pop tune displays, which the students would be able to break down from a quote-unquote classical perspective. The nature of the musical elements is imperative here, as we've seen in previous parts of this podcast, how patterns and techniques repeatedly occur, transcending the stylistic divide and giving credit where credit is due towards the genre of popular music. In terms of consistent connection throughout the years of the audience, my own personal experiences with music is a good reference for how music, no matter the decade or style, can still make a lasting impact on the listener. I was a major academically involved student through my K-12 years, and the thing that turned me in the direction of piano and the pursuit of a higher musical education was, in fact, popular dance and R&B music. For me, standout hits from artists like Usher and LMFAO were the first steps into a universe of sound that eventually led me to classical music. And framed like this, Justification is just not possible in devaluing the potency of popular music, because to one of its own listeners, it could be the very thing that propels them towards exploration of the rest of the vast, diverse musical landscape. Throughout the stance, I have taken and elaborated upon various aspects of classical music compared to popular music. There is sufficient reason and evidence to state that the way we treat and address these styles should not be so differentiated nor thought of as independent identities, to the extent that the current musically educated and non-educated societies distinguish them as. Thank you very much for listening. I've been Matt. Peace.